Okay, welcome back. When we last left off, we had completed the first obstacle in our level that required some real blueprint scripting. And if you remember, it was these falling blocks. So the point where we are at now is we are about halfway through scripting the gameplay in room 3. So when we left off, we had just finished creating these falling block obstacles, and we have made sure that our player can pass through this to the other side. And then also if we get hit, for the most part, we get knocked off the edge, and when we die, we respawn at our player start. Now, again, for testing purposes, my player start is right here in room 3, so I can quickly do tests of this instead of having to run through the whole level. But you just want to be sure that you put this where you need it before you complete your testing. So that being said, we are going to move on to the next area of obstacles, which is over here on this wall. So if we refer back to our level plan, our level map, we've completed room 1, which was no obstacles. It was just building the room. We have completed room 2, which was to create this pit. And now we have the functionality with our player death and respawn for the pits, both here, here, and here. We've completed these falling blocks. So now we are going to work on these fire spurts or spouts. I'm never sure what to call them, but I think you'll understand what I mean. So let's get started on these bits right here. So to make a new obstacle, of course, in the same way that we made these falling blocks here, we need to make a new blueprint class. Now, remember that a blueprint is simply a container that can hold all sorts of different types of actors and assets in it, including gameplay code, which is what we need to code the functionality of whatever we need the objects to do. So let's make a new blueprint class. I'm going to come into my blueprints folder that I made under my contents folder. And right here next to the BP underscore falling block, I'm going to just right click and make a new blueprint class. And this one is also going to be an actor. That is the most generic type of blueprint you can make. So let's call it BP underscore Fire Sprite, I guess. Okay, so double click to open that up. Oh, just took a second to load that. So here we are in our blank blueprint, just like before. I'm going to dock this in next to the level so I can quickly switch back and forth between these tabs. So the first thing I want to add to this is a static mesh actor. Now we're not going to be using a static mesh to represent the actual fire here, but I do want to have some sort of base unit that the fire is going to come out of. So let's start by doing that. So I'm going to come up in here to the components tab. I'm going to click add a static mesh. You can rename it if you like, but in this case, as was the case for the falling blocks, I'm only going to have a single static mesh type component, so I'm just going to leave the name there. Under the static mesh details panel, I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to use the SM cube again. Now you'll recall this is the same static mesh object that we used for the falling blocks. But keep in mind, this is just a placeholder, right? Eventually, in the process of development, you would replace this with an actual art piece. So it's okay in this case that they are going to be the same piece, the same base piece, I should say, because basically I'm just going to scale this to fit my needs, and it's not going to affect the falling block blueprint at all. So I'm just going to scale it down sort of so it's like more flat, and I'm going to hit compile, and I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to return to my level. And the first thing I want to do is place one in the level so I can get a sense of the scale. So I want these to be shooting out sideways from the wall. So I'm going to place it and I'm going to rotate it. Now this is a little bit larger than I had envisioned. So I am going to keep scaling this down. And I want to do that again in the blueprint itself to change the default scale. Now, this is really handy, and I don't know if I discussed this with the falling block blueprint, as it's been a couple days since my last recording, but if you pull out this blueprint editor window and you make any changes, you'll see these changes update in real time on your level, which is just really handy for quickly getting things like scale down. So that was about what I had envisioned for this piece. So let's hit compile and save. I'm going to dock this back, and I'm actually going to move my player start over to this corner just because I've finished testing with this for now. It did have a small bug, but it's not game breaking at this point, so I'm planning on return to that at a later date because game design is really about iteration, and it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect on your first draft. Think of this, again, we're still in the prototyping phase, so think of this very much as a first draft. So as long as it's playable and, you know, there are no game-breaking bugs, it is okay to return to that at a later date. Okay, so here's my player start. I'm just going to move it over so I can just focus on testing this area. So if I hit play, you get a sense of the scale and the placement. That's about right. Maybe want to move it up a little. Again, it's up to you kind of as far as the visuals and design of how you want to place things. So something along those lines. So think of this as like maybe like a stone base tile, and there would be like a hole in it in the final piece, and then the fire would shoot out of the hole. Okay, so let's return to our blueprint and continue testing this. So most things that we've done so far have used trigger volumes, and this blueprint is going to be no exception. We are going to use a trigger volume to detect when our player is in range, basically, of this piece. So this should be pretty familiar to you. Let's go to add. Let's type in box and add a box collision. We're gonna place it based off of the location of our static mesh. So I'm gonna center it over the static mesh, and I'm gonna use these orthographic views to get an idea of where it needs to be. Now, obviously this trigger volume is much too small, so we need to scale it up. And we need to scale it out. So it needs to be a little bit wider and a lot longer than our piece, or I should say our static mesh piece. So in level, this is what this looks like. We want the volume to extend beyond the length, or I should say the width of the catwalk here, so that it forces our player to run through the trigger, and it forces activation of this. I'm just going to shift these over ever so slightly because it's getting a little narrow. Okay, so this is pretty good. Again, you can drag off this window, and it's obviously easier if you have two monitors, but since I'm recording on one, I have to kind of squish them into the screen here, but having two monitors is really handy for stuff like this. So again, I'm going to squish this off to the side, and then I'm just going to scale it, and I'm just eyeballing it about where I think it needs to be. Okay, so that should be pretty good. If you want your players to be able to jump over this as sort of a cheat, you can, leave it like this. Or if you want it to trigger no matter what, whether or not they try to jump through it, you could scale it high. You could scale it taller in this direction here. And then I kind of want to leave, even though this volume is extending down below this catwalk where we don't really need that functionality, I do want to leave this relatively centered on the static mesh part itself, because that will make this object more versatile for reuse in later levels should we choose to make them. So versatility is something you kind of want to think about in your blueprints, because the whole point of blueprints is that they're reusable. So I've scaled this up to be fairly tall just so that our players aren't able to just jump over it and not activate the trigger. So, okay, we have our trigger placed now, and much as we did for everything else, we just want to make sure that this triggers when the player runs through it and doesn't trigger when it intersects with anything else, because again, it is intersecting with these wall pieces, this catwalk piece, and so on. So we only want to pay attention to this trigger when the player runs through it. So we're gonna do this basically the exact same way that we did everything else up to this point. So I'm gonna move through this really quickly because this should all be review. And if you're confused at any point what I'm doing, just go back and watch the falling block tutorial, and that should point you in the right direction. Okay, sorry for the quick break. I was getting a strange bug where I was not able to delete these nodes and all these functions were grayed out, and I believe it was just a small glitch in the editor because I restarted the editor and now I am able to delete and use the event graph as expected. So my apologies for the slight hiccup there. Sometimes things like that happen, and if you're not quite sure what is causing some sort of in-editor glitch, my first suggestion is to always save all your work and just restart the editor, because things like that do occasionally happen. Okay, so let's get back on track here, and let's, as I said, we're gonna move through this trigger functionality pretty quickly because it is largely a review of the trigger functionality we created for the falling block blueprint. So I've deleted my begin play, but no problem. Let me just add it back. I'm just going to right click and type in begin, and here I get event begin play. And the first thing I'm going to do is just create a reference to the player, because of course, in order for this to trigger when the player runs through it, we need to tell this blueprint about the player. Basically, we need to tell it who the player is. So we're going to do get player character, and player index of 0, of course, is the single player. And we're going to cast to third person character. There we go. And I'm just going to promote this to a variable by right clicking and selecting promote to variable and name it player ref, just as I have in the past. Okay, so that is complete. Let's comment it out. Just so we can move all these nodes together. And let's come down here and continue on. I'm going to click on our box collision, and I'm going to open up the details panel, scroll down, and I'm going to add an on component begin overlap event. I'm going to drag out a reference to this player from the variable I just created, and I'm going to check to see if the other actor that intersects with this box is our player. I'm going to hold down B on my keyboard and left click on the graph to add a branch node. Let's connect this execution pin and connect right here. So now if it is the player, right now all I want to do is print a string that is going to say true. And let's hit compile and save it. And let's just test to make sure this trigger is working as expected. Okay, it's printing true up in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And let me see, yes, I can't really jump over it. So even if I try to jump over it, it's still triggering with that true up here in the corner. I just want to make one quick adjustment to the character. So I'm going to go into template, characters, no, template, third person, blueprints, third person character. And I just noticed that my camera is sitting kind of low. It's kind of sitting mid back. And I just want to raise this camera up a little bit. So it's kind of a more over the shoulder view. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select this camera boom. This is a spring arm component, and basically it just, it has the effect of controlling where the camera is and how far away it is from the player. So I'm just going to select this camera boom component, and I'm just going to move it up so it's more aimed at the shoulder. Let's see, it was at 0.4. Actually, I'm going to put it up at, yes, about 60. So I've moved it up about 60 centimeters in the Z direction, which gives it the effect of pointing kind of right between the shoulder blades. And I also think that this length, this red line here, which is the camera boom length, is a little too far. It's making the camera really far away. So I want to bring it in a little bit. So I'm going to change the target arm length under the camera drop down of the details panel of the spring arm component, which is named camera boom here. I'm going to change this target arm length from 400 to 350. Now, your camera controls are largely controlled by what type of game you're making. You know, if you're making sort of a more story-based RPG without a lot of like action and platforming, you can probably stand to have this come in even closer if you are more concerned with the player being able to see details of your world and your other characters up close. However, this is a platformer, and with platformers, it's really important that you're able to see your character's feet at all times. Otherwise, it becomes, you know, just insanely difficult to try to gauge jump distances and things like that. So I'm only going to bring this in by about 50 centimeters, but I think that's going to help a lot. So I apologize there for the digression. Let's just hit play in here to test that out. So yeah, that feels a little bit better to me. Okay, anyway, back to what we were doing. So we have the trigger functionality working the way we expect it to. We can get rid of this print string just by clicking on it and hitting delete. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to actually make the fire component that is going to shoot out of this. Now, things like fire and smoke and sparks are all visual effects. They're not created with static meshes typically, unless it's like a very specialized, stylized game. We're going to make it the more traditional way, which is with particle systems. So to add a particle system to your blueprint, it's the same as you would add any other type of component to your blueprint. So all you have to do is come into add and type in particle and add a particle system. Okay, so I'm going to parent this under the static mesh just by dragging and dropping it. And now we're going to add the type of particle system that we want in the same way that we add this, you know, SM cube to our static mesh slot here. So with the particle system selected, we're going to come over to the details panel, and we're going to come under the particles drop down here. And where it says template, we have a field to fill it in. Now, you may notice that when you click on this, no results come up, and that may appear like a problem. Well, we need something to be in this field in order to fill it in. Now, this is just because we have not created any particle systems yet in our project. However, Unreal does come with a lot of sort of templates and sort of defaults, but you have to sort of enable them. They are hidden by default. So in order to see any results right here without creating a custom particle system, we're going to come up here to this gear icon right here and click on it. And we're going to come down to this menu, and right here where it says show engine content, we're just going to enable that. So that should give you a couple options right here, and you'll see that there's a tutorial particle system right here. And if we click on this, it adds sort of a fire effect. Now, Again, this is not visually maybe what you really want or what you're going for. However, we are still in the prototyping phase. So think of this as a placeholder, the same way this mesh is a placeholder. Eventually it will be replaced by a custom particle system that better suits the needs of your game. So go ahead and add that particle system, and then what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make sure it's placed correctly by coming into my orthographic modes and checking the placements here. Remember that this gizmo is always going to show up at the point of origin or the pivot point for whatever asset you are manipulating. So in the case of particle systems, this is where the particle will start from, start emitting from. So I'm just going to line this up with this mesh here. It can go a little bit inside. Again, this is just a placeholder. I'm also going to scale this a bit down so it's more appropriately scaled to the size of this. Hit compile and save, and let's look at this in our level. Okay, so it looks like that. Not exactly a work of art, but again, this is just a placeholder. So if we hit play on this, you can run through it. You can see that there's no collision for a particle system. Again, it is just a visual effect, but this will represent our fire for the time being. Okay, so let's think about what needs to happen next. Well, we have our particle system. It's coming out. It's going in the right direction, but we don't want this to be on at all times. We want it to only activate when the player runs through the trigger. So let's look at how to do that. In order for this to activate when we are running through it, it has to start deactivated. So to deactivate the visibility of this particle system, we're going to select the particle system here in the components hierarchy, and we're going to come into the details panel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up. You can scroll down to find this, but it's much faster to use the search function. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to click in the search, and I'm just going to start typing the word visible. Now it's under the rendering tab. We have a checkbox that says visible, and it is enabled by default. So let's just disable this for now. And you'll see that instantly in the viewport here, we can no longer see our particle fire, but we have it still present in our component hierarchy. Okay, so now that we have it disabled, we need to tell the blueprint basically to re-enable it after we activate this trigger, which we've already set up the functionality for. So to do this, it's very simple. Let's drag out a reference to this particle system just by clicking and dragging it into the graph. This will be a getter. And from this output node, we're just going to click and drag off, and then we're going to search set visibility. So we're going to use this set visibility node. So we want it to only set it when we're overlapping our component. So let's go off the true node here. And we want to make sure that we set the new visibility to true by checking this box. Okay, let's hit compile and save and see what this has done. So back in our level, let's hit play. We can see we have our blueprint right there, and it is currently off. And if I run through it, it turns on. Pretty cool. Okay, but you'll quickly see the issue here is that once you turn it on, it stays on forever, which is not exactly what we want for this piece. So we're going to pause the recording right here because we're coming up on about 30 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to continue with part 2 of scripting these fire traps. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, welcome back. We just left off working on our fire trap here. What we have right now is a blueprint actor that has a trigger box collision. that sets the visibility of a particle system when the player runs through it. So the next thing we need to work on is, now that we have the ability to turn it on by running through the collision, we need it to turn off at some point, because we don't want it to just run forever once it's activated. We want it to run for a little while, and then after a certain amount of time, we want it to deactivate that fire again. So let's add that functionality in right now. So we've worked a lot with this on component begin overlap in the past, both with this blueprint and with the falling blocks. So we're gonna use a similar concept here, but we're going to want it to trigger when the player leaves this box collision we have here. So luckily enough, there is a pre-written node, just like there is for begin overlap, and it is called on component end overlap. So to access this, I'm just going to highlight the box collision here in my component hierarchy. I'm going to scroll down to where I get these green pluses. And right underneath begin overlap, we have on component end overlap. So let's just hit this plus to add it to our event graph. Now, same thing as when we begin overlapping, we only want this to occur when the player enters or exits the box. So we want to check first if it's the player that is doing the exiting. So all we're going to do here is I'm going to select all these nodes by shift and clicking them. And I'm going to come down here, put my cursor down here where I want them to be. I'm going to hit Control and D to duplicate. So now we just have to connect these pins back up in the way that we want, and we can move them around. Okay, so basically this is saying when the player leaves this box, we want to do something. Well, to turn it on, all we did was set the visibility to true. So to turn it off, all we have to do is set the visibility to false. So let's do the same thing here. Let's just select both of these nodes and let's hit Control D down here to duplicate them. Let's pull this pin off of the true and make sure you uncheck this new visibility node to set this new visibility to false. Let's hit compile and save it. Return to our level tab and hit play to test it. Okay, it turns on when we enter and it turns off when we leave. Great. However, we don't want it to turn off the very second that the player exits the collision. We want it to remain on for a couple seconds. So to do this is very easy. All we have to do is add a delay node in between the player exiting here and setting the visibility to false. So I'm just going to pull off of this true node and I'm going to type in delay. And that's just going to automatically add this node between these two and hook it up appropriately. Now the duration by default is 2 seconds, which is, or I'm sorry, it's 0.2 seconds, which is obviously not really what we want. So let's change this to 1 second. Okay, compile and save, and let's test it again. So we enter, boom, the fire activates, we exit, it waits a little bit, and it goes off. Perfect. Now, I think upon testing this, I need this trigger volume to be a little bit closer in to the static mesh itself. I think it's activating us slightly too early. So I'm just going to return to my blueprint here. I'm going to tab over to the viewport and I'm going to look at it from this angle. And again, I just use I'm holding right click and using the WASD keys to fly around the blueprint the same way that you would in the level. I'm going to select this box. I'm just going to scale it in. I'm keeping it fairly large in this dimension because I don't want the player to be able to just jump over all of my traps. I want them to have to run through them. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. So I can get, up to this close to it before it activates, right? Great. However, I do need to keep this gameplay in mind here. So we need to be able to run through this without actually getting hit by the fire. So in order to do that, because right now what's happening is the moment I enter this box collision, the fire is going to turn on, which makes it really impossible basically to be able to run through this area without getting hurt. I know we don't have really a system for being hurt at the moment, but we are going to add that next. So the only thing I need to add really here is to add a small delay to the beginning of this. So all I have to do here is, so I'm gonna do my on component begin overlap. I'm just gonna select these, I'm gonna move them slightly out. So I wanna give the player a chance to be able to run through these without getting hit. So the same way we did this delay down here, we're gonna add another delay up here. All right, this time I am gonna leave it at 0.2 seconds because I don't want it to be a large delay. Okay, let's test this out now. And yes, at this point, it does look like we will be able to run through it without getting hurt as long as we are quick enough. Okay, so what we really need to do now is we need to make this more meaningful. Actually, first what we need to do is we need to place the rest of our traps. So we have the basic functionality ready to go here, but we only have one. So let's just hold Alt and drag out however many of these that you really want. I need to leave some space in between them. Otherwise, it just won't be possible to traverse this without getting hit. So you do want to leave a little space, and how much space you leave is really up to you and how it feels when you're playtesting. So I'm just eyeballing these. I do have snapping turned on, but it's on a very low grid setting here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift these over so they're a little bit more centered. And I'm just going to play test these. Boom, boom, boom. And they all shut off after 1 second. So if you want them to run a little bit longer for 2-3 seconds, that's very easy to change. You can change it right up here. But that is the basic functionality of our fire here. So let me comment these out. I'm just going to select all the nodes that I want to be in a group. I'm going to hit C on my keyboard to comment, and I'm going to name it activate and deactivate. Okay. Make sure you're always compiling and saving when you're making changes to your blueprint. And that should be all the functionality we need to add for the time being to the fire. So as you're playtesting this, you may notice that you may not be able to tell exactly if you're being hit or not. And that is because we currently have no system of player health or damage. We have a player death, sort of, when our player falls into this pit here. If it reaches a certain height in the negative Z direction from our floor, we just respawn. But we don't have any way of having incremental damage that damages the player but does not instantly kill them. So we are going to be pausing right here, and when we come back in the next video, we are going to be adding a health and a damage and a death system for our player character. So I will see you in the next video.